All right, let's talk about evolution. Just a reminder, this is review of evolution. So I am assuming you learned about evolution at some point in the past, and that I am just reminding you about things pertaining to evolution. Okay, so first, evolution refers to what happens to a population of organisms of a certain species. And it happens because any population has variation. So the individuals are different from each other in certain ways. So these are two peppered moths that we have a picture of. It's just that one of the peppered moths is dark and the other of the peppered moths is light. It's still the species of peppered moths. There's just variation within that species. I want to be really clear, an individual cannot evolve. So that dark peppered moth can't go, oh man, life would be so much easier if I were a light colored peppered moth, and go, ugh, and become a light colored peppered moth. Same thing, the light colored peppered moth can't go, man, I really wish I was darker, ugh, and become darker. So an individual cannot evolve. Only a species, so a population of a species, can evolve. Okay? And it has to happen because of variation. The variation comes from DNA. So DNA is determining the organism's physical traits, and sometimes DNA determines certain behaviors. And so the variation exists in the DNA. So the DNA codes for being a dark colored moth, or the DNA codes for being a light colored moth. Your purpose in life, and the life of every organism, the purpose is to live long enough to reproduce and pass on genes. Your whole goal in life, evolutionarily speaking, is to live long enough to reproduce and pass on your genes. Now, please don't go home and tell your parents that I told you that your goal is to make babies, because that is not your goal. As humans, we have created a society where we have very different goals. But evolutionarily speaking, your goal is to reproduce and pass on your genes. Now, we also know that every organism lives in an environment of some sort. So the environment we're talking about for our peppered moths is these birch trees. And so the peppered moths live in a particular environment. If the organism has traits that work well with the environment and help the organism to stay alive, like this light colored peppered moth on a light bark tree, the organism is going to survive long enough to make offspring and pass on its genes. So when the birds are flying over and the birds are looking for a moth to eat, the bird's eyeballs are going to pick out the dark moths. They're not going to pick out the light moths. So being light in this situation, when you've got light trees, that is an advantage, because the birds can't see you, so the birds don't eat you. If the birds don't eat you, you live long enough to reproduce and pass on your genes. And so now you make more light colored moths. So when the genes get passed on, so does the trait. We see more individuals in the population with that trait, in this case being a light colored moth. But what if the trait doesn't work with the environment? So now we have this light colored moth who thinks he's all fancy pants because he's a light colored moth, but now we have an environment where the tree bark is dark. So that's what happened with the Industrial Revolution. England started kicking out all of this nasty soot and charcoal and smoke and grossness. It coated the trees. We had dark colored tree bark. And now the white moths were like, no, I'm awesome. And the tree bark was like, haha, no, you're not. So that trait became a problem for the individual. So all these light colored moths, now the birds could see them and couldn't see the dark colored moths. And so this was a problem. The individuals probably died before they got a chance to reproduce. And if they died before they got a chance to reproduce, they didn't pass on their genes. So they didn't pass on the genes for being a light colored moth. You know who did pass on their genes? The ones who were dark colored moths. So we ended up with more dark colored moths. So after a certain amount of time, we saw that we had fewer light colored moths, more dark colored moths. So evolution has occurred when the frequencies of the different traits in a population shift. So let's say that we've got a population before the Industrial Revolution. We've got nice light colored bark on our trees, and 98% of the moth population is light colored, and only 2% is dark colored. Again, that variation already exists. Those differences are already there. It's just that most of the time when you see a moth, it's a light colored moth. And every once in a while you see a dark colored moth. And the reason you don't see more dark colored moths is because they're getting eaten by the birds and they're not getting a chance to reproduce and pass on their genes. Okay. But then some huge amount of time passes by. And in this case, it was years and years of the Industrial Revolution, and the tree bark got really dark. And so then that stopped being advantageous. And so after years and years and years, we had this shift in the frequencies. So now only say 10% of our moths are white, are light colored, and 90% are dark colored, because that's more advantageous to them. So I want you to notice nothing new got created, nothing new developed because of evolution. Evolution just meant those frequencies changed. So we had more organisms, more individuals with a particular trait than with the other trait, and then that shifted. So evolution doesn't necessarily mean something new gets created. It just means you have that shift in frequencies. That whole process is called natural selection. Nature is selecting who's going to survive and who's not going to survive. In order for natural selection to work, and therefore for evolution to happen, the traits have to already be there. They have to already be there. Again, no individual can say, you know what would be really helpful for me is if I had XYZ trait and then create XYZ trait. It just doesn't work that way. Okay? Again, and I don't know how to say this enough times, evolution does not create new traits. Evolution does not give us something new that we didn't have already. Okay, so then where did it come from? How did we get opposable thumbs? Because not everybody has opposable thumbs, but we do as humans. This is trippy, but all new traits happen by mistake. So a mistake has to happen. A mistake gave us the opposable thumbs that made us become this dominant species. So all new traits start because an individual makes a mistake while copying its DNA. And those DNA mistakes are called mutations. The accidental change in the code of the DNA means we changed a protein. That means we changed a trait and we got a new trait. It just so happened that when that new trait existed, nature was going to select for it or against it. So if the new trait helps organisms survive, and it helps them survive better than the individuals with the old trait, then we're going to have, first of all, one sad little white penguin who gets laughed at, pointed at, and called names. But if that's going to help that guy survive, that's great. So if the individual with the new trait survives, that individual is going to pass on its genes, and now we're going to see more individuals with that new trait. So maybe at first he was like, oh man, I'm the only one like this. But then he was like, ha, I survived and I got all the ladies. And then they reproduced and passed on their genes. And then we see more and more and more individuals who have that trait that came out of nowhere that happened because of a mistake. The other individuals then are going to lose. They're going to maybe die. They're going to be less, they're not going to be as camouflaged as well, so they get eaten. Maybe they don't get the mates because they're not as pretty. But they're going to be less likely to reproduce. They're going to be less likely to pass on their genes. So we're going to see fewer of them. So maybe at first we've got this one albino penguin and everybody else is a dark colored penguin. But maybe it turns out to be really fantastic for that albino penguin and they reproduce. And in necessary competition, they do better than the dark colored penguins. And all of a sudden we're like, dark colored penguin, that's weird. And we don't remember a time when it was any other way. It could happen though that the mutation makes it harder for the individual to survive. And if it makes it harder for the individual to survive, they're probably going to die without reproducing. And we're just not going to see that trait again. unless some other individual makes the same DNA mistake later on. So somebody who mutated the sickle cell, having a sickle red blood cell is bad. It means that those sickle cells, instead of having nice round cells that flow through your blood vessels, those sickle cells get caught up on each other like this, and they'll clump up in your blood vessels. And when they clump up in your blood vessels, your cells don't get the oxygen that they need, and it's really super painful and can cause actual tissue death, and can be really harmful and life-threatening to people. So that trait, when it comes up, is a bad trait. The individual's probably going to die without reproducing. You could have a really interesting thing, though, with sickle cell disease. The reason sickle cell disease has stuck around is that if somebody's a carrier for sickle cell disease, so they don't necessarily have it, but if they're a carrier for the trait, they have immunity to malaria. And so with that immunity to malaria, they in fact do survive. Okay. So in order for humans to get fully opposable thumbs, lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of mutations had to happen. So there had to be a series of mutations that moved the thumb bones. So first our thumbs were here, then they were here, then they were here, then they were here, then they were here. And each one of those had to be advantageous. So each one of those had to be good and help our ancestors survive. And then there had to be mutations to the muscles that attach the bones to make them work. So a bone that's supposed to be here, but's attached here, the muscles aren't going to attach right. So those mutations had to happen. And then there had to be mutations to other parts of our body, like our spine and our pelvis, to help us straighten up so that then we could stand upright, because if we had to be able to walk on 2 feet in order to be able to use our hands. Otherwise, we're just walking on our hands and they're getting used for that. And these opposable thumbs are just unnecessary. So tons and tons and tons of mutations had to happen, and they all had to happen to individuals. They all had to happen by mistake, and they all had to be beneficial to those individuals in their environments so that they could survive and pass on the genes that coded for those changes. So tons of stuff had to happen in order for all of these things to sort of come together so that we could do this and hold a pencil and write our notes while we were in zoology class. So, important takeaways. Variation has to exist first. The environment determines what's beneficial. So if the environment changes, then what we count as a good thing changes as well. A beneficial trait is one that helps you survive, helps you pass on your genes, and means we're going to see more of that trait out there. A harmful trait means you have a lower survival rate, you're not going to pass on your genes, and you're going to see less of that trait out there. New traits have to come from mutations. Big changes take lots of mutations and lots